No, doesn't. Yeah, now it works. Sorry. My name is Tim Kuik. I work for Brain. We do enforcement also against all kinds of websites and services that are overwhelmingly dealing in infringing material, often by, of course, linking to it. Now, one thing we see when we want to hold them responsible is that the websites are operating anonymously, and they obviously are hosted by hosting providers. We turn to the hosting providers who are reluctant to part with the identity information they have about the website operators, but then when they eventually do, mostly on court order, it turns out that in 99% of those cases, more than 99% of those cases, these identifying details are false. Now, what we are asking the Dutch government to do, we're operating in Holland, is to establish that hosting providers need to at least have a duty to perform best efforts to have their customers, whose websites they host, identify themselves. That's one part of it. Of course, that can be faked, and those who engage in illegal activities will do so. But as a second part to it, we are pleading that there will be an obligation for hosting providers that when they know or ought to know that they have incorrect identity details, to suspend services to such a website, suspend website operators, properly identifies himself. Now, obviously, we're in Holland. We have a big airport, we have a big seaport, and we like to have also a big internet port. It's one of the main internet ports in the world. So government doesn't really want to hassle hosting providers much. Such an obligation could take place, but would have to take place in an international way. I heard that Cyber Douane, a gentleman also mentioned that the identification of the real culprits is the biggest problem. It makes the sites also very nimble, as Ted Shapiro said. So I plead that this is taken on internationally as a result, or as a cause rather, to give us this result, that we can hold the true culprit responsible. Perhaps the Cyber Douane and ICE could comment on that.
And if I could jump in there, actually, I think ICANN might have a role in that as well. I believe those are ICANN requirements for registrars. If it's a registrar that is not, that is allowing its registrant to not have correct registrant details, having false information there, they're in breach of the ICANN rules for registrars. And I would point that ICANN's based in California, which I think is U.S. jurisdiction. So ICE might have something to say about that as well. But I think that would be one avenue to pursue, is complain to ICANN and say, hey, this registrar is not complying with your rules. Ultimately, they could suspend their ability to register domain names if it comes to that. We know about ICANN's enforcement is not so hot sometimes, but that would be one avenue to pursue at least. Yeah, it's almost a burden of proof question. You're saying, yeah, if they're false, suspend immediately, let them fix later, as opposed to give them time to fix it, and all the time they're doing the online business. Yeah, that's a good point. Any panelists have comments? Okay, all right. Let's maybe have, say, one more question. Okay.
Hi, good evening. A lot of the BitTorrent websites have all been closed down, but the next wave of piracy seems to be done with the cyber lockers that you mentioned, and information that is stored and encrypted, downloaded in bits and pieces, which is the latest trend that seems to be happening, which is not easily identifiable in terms of the files that are being downloaded because they're encrypted in some kind of a tunnel. So how are you going to be detecting this and stopping this kind of piracy, because this seems to be on an increase at the moment and very difficult to detect what is being downloaded. Because the software, what it does is, I'm sure you're aware, it downloads it in different streams and different pieces of data, and then it stitches it all up into one file.
Still on. The challenges that you have hit on, and frankly have been hit on by a number of other questions, are exactly why we set up Operation Our Sites as a permanent operation at the IPR Center, because it is going to be an extended law enforcement action, working not only with our agents but with the Justice Department, which has a computer crimes and intellectual property section which is really first rate in terms of its capabilities, has actually its own cyber lab in the District of Columbia. We have U.S. attorneys around the country who have been trained in computer hacking and intellectual property attorneys that they're called. But that's not to say that, and it's, you know, I've been in law enforcement 15 years. It used to be we would go after somebody for a mobile phone that was as big as this microphone. And now I have to deal with mobile phones that can contain money in them and cash that's secreted across the border. So the general problem is that technology is always a challenge for law enforcement. My biggest fear, quite frankly, is that law enforcement, through various its own limitations, has a hard time keeping up. I was sent a digital file yesterday that my Department of Homeland Security server will not let me open because obviously they fear various other issues. So the point being that you've identified challenges. What we have to do is work very hard to find solutions, but nobody, frankly, is saying it's easy. And it's also not, if I could just say, a one-prong approach. We don't claim to be a magic bullet. We don't claim to be the sole solution. It is with civil actions. It is with voluntary cooperation from good corporate citizens that want to do the right thing. And it is from, frankly, meetings like this where everyone has said it, I think. We have come tremendously far since the first global Congress. So I think the best I can tell you is we're going to keep at it and keep going all the time.
I think that's an excellent note to end on, just how far we have come. And as mentioned before, I was on the panel with Natalie back in Dubai 3 years ago. So think back to February 2008. And I think a lot of the things mentioned by each of these panelists was not in existence back in February 2008. Was there a French cyber customs in February 2008? I doubt that. There sure wasn't operation in our sites back then. So we've come very far. Two other developments in the U.S. in our industry, the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company industry. At the urging of the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator, a coalition has been formed that includes search engines, Google being one of those, domain name registrars, payment processors, also known as credit card companies, and shippers, to address the problem of counterfeit and illegal drugs being sold online. They had their first meeting about 3 weeks ago. They're calling themselves the Center for Safe Internet Pharmacies, or CSIP. So just excellent progress in the U.S., and that's about 2 weeks old, so very recent. Also something I read, which is the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition, IACC. They've announced that MasterCard and Visa are willing to work with them to set up a central clearinghouse or reporting site where anyone, I believe, rights owner, maybe even consumers, can report a website selling counterfeits or pirated content and accepting Visa or MasterCard. With no fees to be paid, no indemnification required from the credit card company, so streamlining that whole process. It's just incredible. When we first sat down, the INTA also has a best practices for addressing counterfeits online that came out in December of 2009. I remember being in the conference room at the INTA offices in New York City with the credit card companies, explaining to them the problem. And that was maybe 3-4 years ago, how far they have come to be willing to reach out to the IACC to say, hey, let's make it easier for people to report websites selling this type of content. So we haven't solved it yet, but just great progress being made. I think the Global Congress, we can give partial credit to the Global Congress. So again, thanks to the organizers, and thank you for all the panelists as well. Enjoy the reception.
Just an announcement. Okay. just an announcement about the reception. It will be held outside of the main plenary room, in the exhibition hall. And for the VIP red badge holder,